Hello, my name's Aviva, and today I wanted to share with you all of the books that I read this past week. So I do have 8 books to talk about in today's video, even though I technically only read 7. But last week when I made my wrap up, I did forget to talk about one book, so I'm just adding it into today's video. So if you did miss that wrap up and you wanted to check it out, I will have a link for it down below. But either way, the book that I forgot to talk about last week was the 4th Harry Potter book. So if you've been keeping up with my wrap ups, then you know that I've been slowly doing rereads of the entire series. I did read it for the first time when the only time that I technically read this series was when I was probably around 12 years old, but I'm still considering it a reread because technically my eyes have read these books before. But anyway, I did reread this one specifically the week before this past week, and I had a great time with it. So what's funny is that the first 3 books felt very similar to the movies to me. Like there were hardly any differences, and therefore I was just like, I don't know if I really had to do a reread of this because, it's basically just like watching the movie in a book. And then I got to this one and we finally started getting some stuff that wasn't actually in the book, and I had such a good freaking time with this. Like there were so much extra stuff going on in this one, and that is why I wanted to do the rereads. Like I love the movies, but I really wanted to see the differences in the books, and in book 4 we finally started getting that. And one of my favorite things about this book specifically was the whole like add-on about the elves. Like I remember when I read this book as a kid that there was always a moment where the 2 Weasley brothers had brought Hermione and like whoever else was into the kitchens of the elves, and I just always remember there being a picture and like opening it up and going into the kitchen, and it was just like such a freaking cool thing. And basically when I started rereading this entire series, I started to think that like I made that up in my head because I could have sworn it happened in the 3rd book, and then when I didn't get it, I'm like, that's kind of what I was honestly waiting for, and then it just never ended up happening. But thankfully we ended up getting it in this book, and that is why I really did enjoy this one a ton. Also the whole like Quidditch tournament thing, like that is just not Quidditch tournament. Well, it was the Quidditch tournament, but then it was also like, the actual like tournament thing. Anyway, I had a great time with this one. I'm pretty sure this one might actually be my favorite of the entire series because it was just a ton of fun. So yeah, anyway, I did reread this one and I'm very happy that I did. The thing is that after this one, I ended up getting to book 5, and I did read a book 5 this past week, and unfortunately, I absolutely hated this. So what's funny again is that when I did read this series for the first time, it was at the moment when the 5th movie was coming out, and I remember being about halfway through this book and really struggling through it, and then the movie came out, and I decided to watch the movie because like all my neighbors had come over. Like one of my neighbors' uncles had gotten like an advanced DVD to it. I don't even know how he did it, but basically like right when it came out in the movies, he got like a DVD at the time, and we're all like, okay, let's go watch it, all together. So like literally my entire neighborhood came and we watched the 5th movie together. And I remember being like, well, I'm gonna obviously watch the movie when I have the chance, even though I didn't finish the book yet. And basically I ended up seeing the movie, and I found the movie to first of all be like my least favorite movie out of all of the movies in the Harry Potter series. But then also I'm really not a fan of snakes, and therefore I didn't really love the whole 5th movie with the snake idea. And then on top of that, the whole thing at the end with Sirius really was hard to watch as a 12-year-old or however old I was when it came out. And therefore I didn't end up ever finishing this one because I feel like I had watched it and I didn't even like the movie, and I wasn't even liking the book, so I never ended up, getting through it, and I just jumped to book 6. But this time around, I'm like, you know what? I gotta get through it. And honestly, it was a really big struggle because I found this book to be very, very boring again, even though there was a ton of stuff going on in this book that didn't actually happen in the movies. And I definitely will say that this book was a ton better than the actual movie because like it was just laid out differently and there was so much extra stuff going on. But I still, for some reason, absolutely hated this book. And I honestly was thinking about DNFing it again. Like, I don't know why, but it was such a struggle to get through it, and I can't even pinpoint the reasonings, but basically I did make it through the whole thing, and it definitely was a struggle. So that was that. And then happens to be I am almost done the 6th book in the series, so I literally have like very, very little to finish. So I'm honestly probably going to finish it today, and that's why I'm just like adding it into this video because it will be done by the end of September, which is the end of the week. And I am enjoying this book, but I honestly think that I lost a little bit of momentum after reading book 5. Like book 5 was such a struggle to go through, and book 4 was so freaking good that I kind of just like lost a little bit of interest in continuing on with the series. But I only had 2 books left out of this, 7 books. So I'm like, I really should just finish it just so that I could say like, oh yeah, I reread the entire Harry Potter series. Like just so that like in my head, I can know that I did it. So I have been pushing myself through this book, and I had honestly like a pretty hard time throughout the first half of it or so, but now it's finally picking up. Like, I think why I always loved this book was, first of all, the whole thing at the end was serious. Like when we get to go in his head and the whole idea of like, getting to see Harry's mom as a child and that whole situation. Like, I remember always loving that part in this book. And then happens to be, I'm like literally right up to it now. Like I just got to the moment where Sirius had found Harry doing that crazy spell. So he's like, come down to my office, and they're about to go do that whole fighting thing. So basically I am up to my favorite part in the book, and I'm noticing that like as it's getting later in, I am enjoying it a lot more. Also the whole thing with like Harry starting to realize his feelings for Ginny, and like I think that's why I really love this book, because that whole part of the story finally like started picking up, and like the whole thing with like Hermione and Ron, like that's starting to pick up in this book, and I really am enjoying it for that reasoning. But I think like everything else about the book, the whole beginning with like just slowly finding out about the Horcruxes is kind of what was boring me a little bit, but thankfully it is picking up as I'm getting later in. So at least I will try to finish this series probably over the next week, because I only have one book left. So basically that is more or less where I'm at with my Harry Potter rereads, and it isn't going too bad. So that is that. And then happens to be, I did also do a couple of Mariana Zapata rereads this week. I don't know why, but I was just like really in the mood. I think it was because the other week I did DNF her new release, and it kind of like put me into like, oh my God, I can't believe I DNF'd a book from one of my favorite authors. So I kind of decided to jump back into some of her old books that were my absolute favorite. I remember why I really love her. So this past week, I ended up reading all three of these books again. So I did reread All Roads Lead Here, and I absolutely loved it. This was actually the first book that I ever read by her, and I always remember really enjoying it, but I had this weird thing about it, thinking that it had a very, very, very slow start, and therefore it was never my favorite. But now that I finally did a reread of it, after I had reread every single one of her other books, I realized that this is such a classic Mariana Zapata. Like, it definitely does not have a slower burn than her others. Like, Wait for It, I felt like had way more of a slower start than this one, and therefore I'm pretty sure that this one might now be my favorite. And I know that I just made that whole Mariana Zapata, like, how to read all of her books and everything like that. I'll have my video for that link down below. I basically talked about every single one of her books, what they're about, how I recommend reading them, all of the overlaps in all of her books, because even though they're standalones, they all like have a couple of like cameos and things like that. So I made an entire book. I made an entire video about that. So I'm not going to actually go into any details about these books, but when I made that video, like literally a couple of weeks ago, I had said how this one was not my favorite. And now I think I'm changing my mind on that and saying that this one might be my all-time favorite from Mariana Zapata, because the one thing that I always remembered not loving about it was the slow start, and now I realize that that is not the case for this book. And then on top of it, I really liked how we actually got a little bit of, time with the characters actually being together, which we don't often get in some of her books. Like, I always feel like I'm like itching for just like 2 or 3 more chapters with the couple actually being together. And in this book, we actually do get that. Like, they literally get together, and then we get a couple of moments just closing up all of the plot lines that were going on in this book. And I really did appreciate that aspect of this book, and that is one of the many reasons why I'm deciding that this one is my favorite. I mean, I loved obviously everything about it, but then on top of that, I feel like it was just one of her more well-rounded books, and that is why I'm choosing it as my number 1. So that is how this reread went. And then I did also do a reread of Wait for It, and this one, what's funny is that it had the opposite effect on All Roads Lead Here did on me, because this one, I never had thought that it technically had a very slow start, even though I know that people say that. But when I had read it, I kind of just like jumped into it, and I really got invested right away, and therefore I never felt it. But happens to be this time around, I did have a bit of a hard time through the first 200 pages or so, and that is like now why I realize that people say like, oh yeah, it does have a bit of a slow start. And the thing is that I think why I felt that way is because I knew what was coming. I had recently read this book, well, not recently, I think I read it maybe like in February or something, so it was one of the more recent books that I had read by her, versus like All Roads Lead Here I had read over a year ago. So this one, I feel like I was just like, I already knew what was coming, and I really just wanted to get to certain scenes, and therefore I wasn't patient enough for it, So basically, like, I should have gone into it knowing like, okay, this one's gonna have a slow start, and then I kind of got a little bit antsy as I got later into it, and I think that is why I enjoyed this just slightly less than I did the first time that I read it. But honestly, I still absolutely love the book, and I don't think that it actually has any issues. It just did have a slower start than I remember having. So that is my thoughts on my reread for Wait For It. And then happens to be last night, I just finished reading Luna and the Lie. And this one I honestly was not planning on rereading. Like, I wasn't technically planning on rereading 3 of my favorite Mariana Zapata books this week, but I just somehow kept picking up more and more of them. And I really did enjoy my reread of this one. I am pretty sure my favorite thing about this book is the ending groveling moment. Like, we got, because Mariana Zapata is such a slow burn writer, she wrote the best groveling moment at the end. Like, basically he messes up for a moment and he has to win back her, like, you know, her favor and everything like that. And we just spent so much time with him making it up to her. And literally, like, that is why I love this book. I mean, obviously it's good for so many other reasons. Like, there's a one bed trope, there's a nightmare scene. It has such a strong grumpy sunshine. Like, he is so freaking grumpy, and she's one of the most positive and you know, happy main characters that Mariana Zapata has ever written. So it's just a strong grumpy sunshine, which I absolutely loved, even though I don't absolutely love her, because I do think that she's a little bit too nice and a little bit too positive for me. And she's a tad of a pushover, and I don't mean to say that in a mean way, but I just think that that is something that you know, like, have a little bit of a backbone at sometimes. You know, like, I loved how at the end she really finally stood up for herself, and that's why she didn't give in to him too quickly, and that's why he had to grovel. But throughout the majority of the book, I feel like she just let people like push her around, and I didn't really absolutely love that aspect of her, but it didn't really like make me not enjoy the story. So I still love this book a ton. I'm very happy that I reread it, and I'm pretty sure I enjoyed it just as much the second time around as I did the first time around. So definitely would recommend reading this one as well if you have not read it yet. But anyway, after this, I did one more reread this week, and that was Forbidden by CoraSorensen. So I have talked about this book a ton on my channel, but I'll just quickly retell you what it's about in case you're not familiar, because I definitely would recommend reading this book if you haven't yet. And this is about this guy who is an ex-MMA fighter, and 2 years ago his wife had died, and he had decided to retire so that he could be with her, like, you know, before she passed away. And now he is basically a single dad, and he decides at the beginning of the book to purchase this boxing gym, and he's gonna end up having a romance with the manager who was there before he purchased her. Like, you know, he basically like took all of the employees when he purchased the gym, and she was the manager beforehand, and basically it's gonna end up being their romance. And also, for the size of the book, it is technically a slow burn because the couple doesn't really get together until like way later in the book. So it's not a slow burn as Mariana Zapata, because, like, you know, look at the different sizes of these books, but for the size of it, it is a really good angsty, tension-filled slow burn romance. So if you haven't read it yet, I definitely recommend reading it, because if I have not said it yet, I'm pretty sure this is my favorite book by this author, and I have read a bunch of her books, so that is really saying something, especially because I went and reread this one and still feel that way. So that is that. But anyway, after this, I have one more book that I wanted to share with you, and it is actually the only book that is not a reread for this video, and that book is The Devil You Know by Elizabeth O'Rourke. So this is technically the third book in one of her companion series. I think it's called like the Devil Companion series. And I had read the first book in this series and I really loved it. And I even own the second book, but the third story really intrigued me the most. So I kind of wanted to skip book 2 and jump to book 3 right away, because I was just like very intrigued by this whole, like, you know, the storyline basically. And if you're not familiar with this book, it's basically about these 2 lawyers who work together. Like, he is a partner in this company and she basically is wanting to make partner. And they very much don't get along, because right when he came on to like their firm, he basically stole a really big client from her. So she has basically hated his guts ever since. And now it's like a couple of years later, and they're about to get partnered to work on this like next case together. And if this case goes well, she might actually finally get that promotion she's been waiting for this entire time. So she's really gonna have to be on her best behavior and get along with him and everything like that. And it's just gonna be their romance. So it's basically like, you know, an enemies to lovers workplace environment thing. Very, very classic, that sort of vibe. Like, if you've read The Hating Game, if you've read, like, I can't even think off the top of my head, but it has a lot of very classic things going on for enemies to lovers workplace environments sort of stuff. And I don't really want to spoil the book for you and tell you what it's actually like, you know, the details about it, because it was a very quick, short read, and I definitely would recommend reading it, so the details shouldn't matter. But I will say that it does have a very guy falls first, guy falls harder, he chases after her sort of vibe, and it was just a really, really good time. And the one thing that I do want to say just a little bit on the negative side about it was that there was a little bit of miscommunication at the end that I wasn't extremely fond of, and that was mostly because this was from a single person's POV. Like, it was just from her POV. We never really got to see Ben's side of things, and he wasn't very communicative. Like, he just like would not share a lot of stuff with her up until like the way end, and you get to find out why, and it really did make sense for the story. But I will say that I'm not a fan of miscommunication, and there were some moments in here where it's like, if they would have just had a conversation with each other, then it kind of could have you know, circumvented some of the stuff that ended up going on later on in the book. So with that said, that is my one negative thing to say for it. I did end up giving this book like a 4.25 stars because it really was a very 5-star-ish feeling read up until the end when all of that little drama started to happen because of the miscommunication and things like that. And that kind of did bring my rating down. But besides for that, I really did thoroughly enjoy the read. So basically, I would recommend it. That was my one fault that I found in it, but that's not really too much of a fault to tell you not to read it. It's just something that, you know, that's going to come up later in the book. And I know that a lot of people don't necessarily love miscommunication. So just know that that happens, but it shouldn't be the reason that you don't actually pick it up. So that is that. But anyway, with that said, that is all the books that I ended up reading this past week. So I'm curious to know if you've read any of these books, what you thought about them. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comment section. But either way, if you enjoyed watching my video, then please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you are not currently subscribed. And either way, thank you so much for taking the time to watch my video because I really do appreciate it. And until next time, enjoy reading.